Is there reason to believe that this year just won't be the same in the game? MarkRogersTV, the voice of college football, breaking down Ohio State and Michigan from both sides throughout the week. We got Pat Murphy on the line from Bucknuts. Please join him there at 247 Sports and covering Ohio State football. Pat, how you doing today?
I'm good. It's Michigan week, which means we've made it through most of the college football regular season, but certainly a big week here in Columbus, and I imagine equally as big up in Ann Arbor.
That's right. As soon as the teams come off the field that previous week with Ohio State, it was the win against Penn State. You walk off the field, game's over. Okay, it's officially Michigan week.
Yep.
Before we go to Michigan, because the game was so important and because there are various ways to spin the final score and the outcome of the game, one being that Ohio State dominated statistically, gifted Penn State with a lot of points. Everything but a 75-yard Penn State drive, or that Ohio State was sloppy. Penn State hung around. They didn't blow them out. They didn't dominate on the scoreboard, 28-17 with only a 21-17 game with like 9 or 10 minutes left. How do you spin this one?
I think you can look at it a little bit of both ways, frankly. I think obviously Ohio State did themselves no favors with 3 turnovers, one of which was Justin Fields fumbling as he went into the end zone, took what looked like 7 points off the board on Ohio State's second offensive possession. And then 2 turnovers in the second half, another one from Fields and one from J.K. Dobbins, 2 guys that you haven't seen turn the ball over much this year. And both of those led directly to Penn State points, one a touchdown, one a field goal. So for the most part, as you said, Ohio State controlled the game. They were able to build a 21-0 lead early in the third quarter. Penn State wasn't able to move the ball until that long touchdown drive you mentioned. And Penn State was able to capitalize on Ohio State mistakes. And let's not take away from Penn State's side of creating turnovers. It's not just like Ohio State was dropping the ball. I mean, these Justin Fields, J.K. Dobbins were getting hit. Micah Parsons had one of the fumbles in the second half. Lamont Wade had another forced fumbles, that is. So, Penn State was able to fight back into this game one way or the other, and it just so happened to be through turnovers. So you can spin it however you want. I think this was a good thing to happen to Ohio State going into the Michigan game, just because now you have the players' attentions from a coaching perspective. You can look at them and say, look, we didn't come out and play perfect. You have to prepare. You have to make sure you have ball security figured out in these bigger games, these top 10 like games. So if Ohio State cruises through Penn State, we're talking about great stuff when it comes to the Buckeyes. But when you're trying to coach them up for what'll certainly be a intense rivalry game this Saturday, it may be better that you can point to the film and say, this is what you did wrong. Here's how we fix it, as opposed to trying to coach off of, another blowout win.
Yeah, I always try to look at the turnovers themselves in regards to the play itself to determine, because there is a random factor to turnovers. A ball gets deflected, a receiver should have caught it. It was right in the chest, and the defense just happened to be there, and the safety picks it off, et cetera, et cetera. Running back and quarterback collide in the backfield, and the ball's on the ground, and the defense gets the gift there. But there are forced turnovers, and good defenses force turnovers. And for the most part, that's what we saw with Penn State getting back in the game against Ohio State. It was almost like that Buckeyes defense. And this was the impressive factor for me in this game, was that through it all, Penn State had a 75-yard drive in which they got themselves reasonably in the game at 21-7. The rest of the points were right there for them. Sure, they had to complete the second touchdown drive of 11 yards.
Right.
It was like the Ohio State defense dominated the first half with 5 punts, and that was Penn State's offense punting every time they had the ball. And then it was like that last one that Penn State had the opportunity to tie the game, that Ohio State just the defense just clamped down and gave up nothing. No yardage, sacks, boom, they had to kick the field goal. And then it was like, that was Ohio State's defense making a statement to say, this isn't going any further. And then the last 10 minutes of the game, they just annihilated Penn State's offensive line and just snuffed it out.
Yeah, and let's not forget, Sean Clifford left this game, Penn State's starting quarterback, in the third quarter. They bring in, I believe it's Will Levens, who was much more of a dual threat. They did a lot more read option stuff. So Ohio State's defense had to make some adjustments. And you saw it on some of those drives. I mean, and give Levens credit, he was squeaking through that line and picking up, chunk yardage as needed. So it was an adjustment by Penn State when Clifford left the game, and then Ohio State's defense had to adjust, back. So, it changed the game plan for both teams and, made for a different offensive game for Penn State. And once Ohio State's defense, as you mentioned, once they got the read options figured out, Penn State wasn't able to really move the ball. But yeah, it did take some time, and that certainly I think was part of the recipe for getting back in that game for Penn State. And that's not to say that Sean Clifford needs to be benched or anything like that. It was just you prepare for one quarterback the whole week. You don't expect an injury like that to occur from an Ohio State defensive perspective, and then the game plan kind of changes all of a sudden, and you got to get the players on the same page with this new defense. And Ohio State eventually did that, which I think shows, kind of what this defense can do in terms of making adjustments. But it did take a couple series, and Penn State was able to get back in the game during that time.
Christmas is coming, folks. Shop Amazon. Use the link in the description section below. Same shopping experience that you would get otherwise, but you use the link and you help us build the channel if you love the discussion, debate, and analysis each and every day on Ohio State and the rest of the nation. We got Pat Murphy on the line, Bucknuts 247 Sports. Encourage you to jump over there and check out their insight and information on Ohio State athletics. Ohio State's arguably the best team in the country. Michigan's more in the top 10 to 12 range. I think that's pretty fair analysis right now. Ohio State probably has to play a C game to lose this one, but we're hearing about weather. We have the incentive factor in regards to, for Ohio State, it's a playoff, but maybe Michigan, it falls into their lap in regards to just playing loose and fancy free and nothing on the line. And we can go try to steal a win and ruin Ohio State's season and just lay it all out there. Michigan at home. Again, I go back to the weather, probably playing in Michigan's favor to an extent because the Buckeyes so effective throwing the ball, although Michigan has gone that route in recent weeks of just really putting it up and putting up big passing yardage numbers. And then you've got the Justin Fields, the hand issue, and he's gotten beat up a little bit. How much do they run him? Trying to win the game, but also trying to protect him. J.K. Dobbins coming off a 36 carry effort. So your concerns about Ohio State possibly being upset and where that could come from?
Well, I think you hit on a lot of valid points there. And also just the fact this is that rivalry game, the old expression, throw the records out type of thing. And you've seen that plenty of times, whether it be Ohio State or Michigan, being the underdog, coming in and spoiling the other team's season. Last year, obviously, Michigan came to Ohio Stadium as the favorites and the number one defense in the country and all this and lost, 62-39 or whatever the final score was, something like that. So, there will certainly be motivation on Michigan's side to avenge last year's loss. Ohio State obviously is playing for a chance to go back to the college football playoff. There is a chance that they could lose this game, win the Big Ten, and still make the playoff, but you don't want to leave that up to chance if you're Ohio State. You mentioned the health of Justin Fields. From all indications we're getting, he's fine. Obviously, he had the scare at the end of the game. A weird play, really, when Ryan Day decides to go for it on fourth down, and instead of either kicking a long field goal or even a short punt, and they try and run Justin Fields, and he ends up getting hit and staying down, but popped back up, jogged off the field, took the final offensive snap a drive later to take a knee, and then was celebrating with his teammates on the field and the fans that rushed field. So I think he's going to be fine for this game. It wouldn't surprise me if this is another game where he does have to run the ball a decent amount, especially if there is weather like you mentioned. So I think all of that plays a part. And let's not forget, Michigan's playing some good football. We've touched on it a couple times when I've been on with you, but since that second half of the Penn State game, when they came back and made that game closer than it looked like it was going to be, this has been a pretty good football team. Obviously, they had their struggles early in the year. The Wisconsin game probably stands out the most among those, but just throttling Notre Dame in another game with some inclement weather. And that was a Notre Dame team who at the time, I believe, was still in the top 10. So, a team people thought highly of. And, they've just been rolling, defeating Michigan State in blowout fashion, having a good game last week against a tricky Indiana team on the road. So, it's not like Ohio State's walking into this game as massive favorites, or, that this Michigan team has continued to struggle. I think these are teams probably playing some of their best football, the turnovers aside for Ohio State last week, of the season as we get down. And that's what you want to see. That's what makes Ohio State and Michigan a fun rivalry, when these two teams are both out of state, as we're saying. So, I expect we've sat, here.
Okay, I just want to make sure there was a little break up there. You can get my pick on Ohio State, Michigan, and the rest of rivalry weekend. Just grab the link in the description section below. Voice of College Football Community, 11-6 against the spread last week, 57% against the spread this season, 77% straight up. All right, we got Pat Murphy on the line from Bucknuts to talk Ohio State and Michigan. You talked to the players today, and so there's an angle right there. What do they think about all this? I'm sure there's a different slant depending on whether the kid grew up in Ohio or grew up elsewhere. I know that certainly Jim Tressel and Urban Meyer ingrained in the athletes coming from across the country. Hey, let's introduce some culture to you here at Ohio State and how important this game is. And we're going to talk Michigan all year long, and you're going to become a true Buckeye in regards to paying respect to this rivalry and knowing what it means. What did the players have to say?
Yeah, it's a similar vibe around Ohio State. Even though Ryan Day has taken over as head coach, he is not an Ohio guy like the two you mentioned in Jim Tressel and Urban Meyer, but he's been in the program for the last few years. He's been a part of this rivalry both of those seasons. So, I think that this game means as much to him as it does to anyone. I think he also knows the man that he's replacing, and Urban Meyer did replace, went 7-0. And, if Ryan Day starts off with everything positive he's done, winning all these games, going undefeated so far this season, if he loses to Michigan, it's not a great look, given Ohio State's dominance in this rivalry. So they have very much made it an emphasis this week, and not just this week, starting in winter workouts when they have their team up north, as they call it, periods and whatnot. It's been just as much of a focus as it has under Meyer, under Tressel. And from the players' perspective, I think all the guys we talked to today were out of state guys. But guys that most of which have been around the program for a while. Tuff Borland, Pete Warner, both have played in the game. Chris Olave, we talked to today. He had a breakout game as a true freshman last week, catching 2 touchdowns against Michigan and blocking a punt, kind of announcing himself, not only to Ohio State fans, though he'd made a few plays before then, but to the college football world. Obviously, he's propelled that into a very good season this year. Wyatt Davis, who got his first real action against Michigan last year when he had to step in for an injured offensive lineman. So, guys like that who, have been a part of this rivalry in one way or the other. They may not be from Ohio. Tuff Borland's from Illinois, I believe. Pete Warner, Indiana. So those guys at least grew up in the Midwest. But Chris Olave and Wyatt Davis, both California kids who admitted, look, I knew that this was a rivalry game. I obviously heard about Ohio State, Michigan growing up, but until you get here, you get involved in the program and it becomes an everyday thing. And then when you get in the game and you just feel how hard everyone hits, how that game plays out, it's just different. And they admitted that much. They had to really learn about it. Even Ryan Day said, he took his son. They have at the practice facility in Columbus, they have a little atrium with all of the trophies and whatnot. And on the wall there, they've got a giant TV that plays this little Michigan movie on loop. And he and his son went and sat down and watched that so that his son would learn about the rivalry. So, Ohio State's always taken this seriously. I don't expect that to be any different. I believe the players are well aware of what's coming on Saturday, regardless of whether they're in-state kids, out-of-state kids, coaches, whatnot. And then I guess the other angle is Greg Madison and Al Washington were both members of the Michigan staff last year. Greg Madison had been in Michigan for quite some time. So while we didn't get to talk to them, we did ask some of the players about those two. Sounds like they're both very motivated to have their position groups, their team ready to go into Ann Arbor and get a win.
Yeah, it's certainly a situation anecdotally that I will rest on, being the biggest and most popular rivalry in the country in college football, because when I've lived elsewhere, sure, everybody always talks about whatever the rivalry is there, in state, regionally. College football is great for rivalries. I believe it's the best sport when it comes to rivalries, rich traditional rivalries for almost everybody. But the first one that's brought up after the one that's in that region is Ohio State, Michigan. And that seems to be my experience, definitely, when talking about the game. I don't know exactly, Pat, what they're doing there at the league office at the Big Ten, because Ohio State for the past 15 years has been the team that is going to win a national championship in this conference. And I know you can argue some other schools are knocking on the door to a certain extent, but until we see different, this is the team that can win a national championship. And to hand them a schedule that goes Penn State, Michigan in a Big Ten championship game against most likely a top 10 to 15 team in the nation just doesn't seem like it's too bright of the league to set up its, give them a difficult schedule, but spread out the games and don't backload it like that. It just doesn't seem too practical.
Yeah, it certainly was interesting when the schedule came out, kind of breaking it down. I mean, there were games, obviously, you could point to maybe the trip to Nebraska before the season, or Wisconsin and Michigan State coming to Columbus, but the schedule was certainly backloaded. You knew Penn State was going to be very good. You knew Michigan was going to be very good, and some people expected them to be, the favorite in the Big Ten coming into the year, if we remember back. So, that was certainly going to be a tough task for Ohio State to end the game with those two. Anytime they've really had, a game right before the Michigan game, you always have this kind of conversation, a game that, isn't one that they're heavily favored in. I mean, they've played Rutgers, they've played Illinois, teams like that the week before the Michigan game. And while you obviously have to take those games seriously, you don't want to trip up there and get an upset. It does allow you to kind of get through the game, oftentimes get the starters out early and begin preparing for Michigan, get guys rested up. They weren't able to do that last week, even up 21-0 in the third quarter against Penn State. I don't think the starters are coming out very early, if at all, just because you know what Penn State can do offensively. So, yeah, I mean, Michigan had a somewhat tough game going to Indiana, but it wasn't the same level of physicality as the Penn State game. But as Ryan Day has said all year when asked about different parts of the schedule, we roll with what they give us. They're not going to try and make excuses or anything like that. And, if anything, it's got these guys, like I said earlier, it's got to get these guys' attention, and, they know what it's going to take in a big game like this, having just played in one.
MarkRogersTV, the voice of college football, discussion, debate, and analysis on the game we love each and every day. I don't care if it's May, June, we talk college football nonstop the entire year with guys like Pat Murphy from Bucknuts at 247 Sports. The thing that I will throw out there as well, man, I lost my train of thought. I'm going to have to edit that. My goodness, I had something on the top of my head. Okay, here we go. MarkRogersTV, the voice of college football. We discuss, debate, and analyze college football all year, all the time, certainly on rivalry week, but we do this 24/7, 365, even in May and June with guys like Pat Murphy from Bucknuts. All right. A turnover fest would obviously play into the hands of Michigan. If Ohio State turns it over 5 times, that is the obvious answer to an upset formula, like that flurry against Penn State. Other than that, Pat, what are your concerns? What would spell a Michigan victory in this one for you?
I think there's a few things you can point to. Michigan, since, like we talked about, that Penn State game, when they started to turn things around, especially offensively, has hit on a lot of big plays, especially in the passing game. They've got talented receivers. Shea Patterson is playing arguably the best he's played in his career, Michigan's quarterback. Ohio State secondary has been very good this year, but I'm not sure they've played the level of receivers, at least talent-wise, that Michigan has. So if Michigan's able to establish that passing game, you talked about the weather, and that could complicate things. But if Michigan's able to hit on some of those big plays, I think that could at least, make this closer than Ohio State would like it to be. Michigan hasn't been dominant rushing the ball. Ohio State's proven that they can do things both rushing and passing. J.K. Dobbins is having obviously a fantastic year. Justin Fields, as you mentioned earlier, is coming off of a big rushing day in terms of number of carries, a career high. So they can move the ball on the ground. And while Michigan's defense is certainly good, we've seen Ohio State manage the rushing attack against top-ranked defenses throughout the season. So I think that'll be key. Can Michigan find, the passing game that's helped them kind of turn this season around, going up against Ohio State's secondary, which has been the best in the country all year? I think that'll be a big part of it. But the rushing game will also play its part. It always does in these type of games. Tuff Borland and Pete Warner both talked about that today. As linebackers, they know they have to stop Michigan's rushing game, and Ohio State has to establish theirs. So, I think whichever team is really able to control things on the ground, obviously you can move the clock, stuff like that. But if you can hit one or two big plays through the air as well, especially if you only have an opportunity to do it one or two times with poor weather conditions, that could change the game in my mind.
Pat, you mentioned how well Justin Fields is playing, 33 touchdowns, 1 interception. As soon as you said that, for some reason, my mind went back to the spring and the alarm that sounded around Buckeye Nation when Justin Fields went 4 of 13 in the spring game. Boy, that was a long time ago.
Right.
Remembering that right now, but my goodness, that was like the world was coming to an end for a lot of people, that this kid wasn't what he was advertised to be. But the offense has been amazing. I was again reminded today in looking at some numbers, number 1 scoring offense in the country, number 1 scoring defense. This team has played 11, despite a quick flurry of 3 minutes against Penn State, basically played complete games for 11 straight, with Michigan out ahead and trying to continue a dominance in this rivalry that dates back to Jim Tressel's early time at Ohio State. Pat, we appreciate you stopping by. Enjoy the game. Enjoy Thanksgiving weekend. Hope you enjoy the football, the food, the family, the whole deal.
Thanks. You too.